Why victory in the Atlantic betrayed the U-boat war. The moment the tide turned. The alarm shrieked through the cramped hull like a scream from the deep. The Metox radar receiver flashed a single pulse, an approaching signal from nowhere. Seconds later, the sky above the Atlantic tore open with the roar of bomber engines. Lieutenant Karl Heinz stuck his head up the conning tower just in time to see a blinding white light sweep the surface. He shouted the order to dive, but it was already too late. Depth charges splashed down around them, and the water turned into thunder. In moments, silence swallowed the ocean once more. For the first time, the hunters knew what it felt like to be prey. Only months earlier, those same officers thought they were untouchable. German U-boats ruled the Atlantic. They haunted shipping routes, severed Britain's lifeline, and left entire convoys burning in their wake. Newspapers in Berlin spoke of it as if it were destiny. Admiral Dönitz had built his wolfpacks into the spearhead of a new kind of war, one fought invisibly beneath the surface. By early 1943, the numbers looked unstoppable. Allied losses were rising, morale in London was cracking, and the Atlantic seemed like a German lake. But that night, the one where the radar warning screamed, something fundamental shifted. The ocean had turned against them. The same darkness that once shielded the U-boats now hid their enemies. Invisible aircraft patrolled overhead, their new radar cutting through fog, storm, and night as if the sea itself had betrayed its secrets. The very instruments the submariners trusted, Metox receivers, encrypted radios, the mechanical heartbeat of German precision, were now the tools by which they were found. For the men inside those steel coffins, the feeling was unmistakable. The tide had turned. To see how that happened, you have to rewind to the height of their power. The U-boat arm began as a desperate gamble for Germany. It offered a chance to starve Britain before American industry could tip the scales of the war. Convoy after convoy was struck down, the survivors limping toward port only to find another attack waiting. In those early months, the Atlantic was a graveyard stretching from Halifax to Gibraltar. Dönitz watched the tonnage graphs climb and believed victory was inevitable. Yet buried inside that success was the beginning of defeat. Each radio message that coordinated his wolfpacks, every triumph broadcast back to command, revealed more than the Germans realized. Every burst of confidence, every unguarded signal, was a breadcrumb the Allies were quietly collecting. What looked like mastery of the seas was, in truth, a growing web of vulnerability. So the question was never simply how the Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic. It was how the Germans lost it from the inside out. How a campaign that promised to strangle Britain wound up strangling its own navy. The answer lies in the unseen battles, a war of codebreakers, scientists, and mathematicians, of shifting tactics and impossible odds. It's a story where early brilliance turned into blind faith, and where victory itself became the trap. The ocean didn't suddenly change. The Germans did. They mistook early dominance for permanence, ignoring the quiet revolutions happening in Allied laboratories and map rooms. Those innovations, radar, sonar, escort carriers, and intelligence networks, were invisible at first. But when they finally surfaced, they dismantled the U-boat empire piece by piece. That night in the North Atlantic was just one moment in a far larger reversal. A single radar pulse marked the beginning of the end for an entire strategy born from confidence and secrecy. What had once been domination became desperation. And beneath those waves, the U-boats discovered that sometimes the first taste of victory is the beginning of betrayal. The apex of the wolfpacks. In the winter of 1943, the Atlantic breathed with menace. Convoys stretched across the grey horizon like veins feeding a desperate island, and beneath them, the U-boats waited, silent, patient, and lethal. Every few nights, the sea erupted into a storm of explosions as torpedoes struck home. For the sailors aboard merchant ships, it felt as if the ocean itself had turned hostile. For the German submarine crews, it was triumph. This was the apex of the wolfpacks. Admiral Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat strategy, had finally shaped his vision into reality, a living system of steel predators sweeping across Allied shipping lanes. Each submarine was no longer a lone hunter. Instead, dozens coordinated through encrypted radio messages, forming long patrol lines that stretched hundreds of miles. The first contact would shadow a convoy, call in reinforcements, and then, as night fell, they pounced together. 6, sometimes 10 boats striking at once. For the Allies, no amount of courage seemed enough. The Atlantic convoys were enormous, 40, 50, sometimes 70 merchant ships packed with fuel, food, and weapons. But against these synchronized attacks, they were fragile. The escorts were few, the skies often empty, and technology favored the hunters. Depth charges worked only when the target was submerged, and most U-boat attacks came from the surface, where radar was too crude to spot them. At night, they blended seamlessly into the dark. Every successful strike fed the illusion that the U-boat war was decided. Between January and March 1943, Allied shipping losses reached catastrophic levels. More than 500,000 tons went down in a single month. Britain's lifeline to North America frayed to its thinnest strand since the war began. Newspapers in Germany celebrated the Zweitglücklich Zeit, second happy time. The phrase echoed across propaganda reels. The Atlantic was conquered again. Inside the cramped pressure hulls, morale soared. Commanders swapped victory tallies over the intercom. 5 ships sunk, 6, sometimes entire convoys obliterated. Crews painted tonnage symbols on the sides of their conning towers like fighter aces marking kills. To them, the war was mathematical. More ships down meant fewer supplies reaching Britain, and fewer supplies meant collapse. Dönitz believed they were on the brink of that collapse. His headquarters tracked Allied losses through meticulous charts, the upward curves confirming everything he'd promised Hitler. The U-Bootswaffen, once dismissed as a minor force, had become the pride of the Kriegsmarine. Every officer understood their place in Dönitz's system of tonnage warfare. Victory wasn't about battles won, but about numbers sunk. As long as the curve kept rising, Germany had hope. But statistics can lie. The tonnage chart didn't show the growing industrial might behind those sinking ships. It didn't reveal that, for every merchantman lost, 2 more were launching from American shipyards. It didn't show that the Allies were quietly closing the mid-Atlantic air gap with long-range patrols. To Dönitz, none of that mattered, yet. His wolfpacks refined their choreography. Patrol lines stretched from Greenland to Biscay. Signal traffic pulsed between boats and command in Naval. A convoy sighted. Coordinates flashed across the Atlantic in coded bursts. Nearby subs received orders to converge. Within hours, they'd encircle the target. The first torpedo hit often caused panic, breaking formation, and scattering the escorts. That chaos was the Wolfpack's real weapon. For the British, it felt endless. Sailors gave names to U-boats they never saw, imagining them as sea monsters. Some convoys were reduced to flaming wreckage within sight of each other. Survivors spoke of hearing the laughter of German voices through the noise of the night, though whether anyone truly laughed out there is uncertain. Still, the illusion of invincibility hardened. Inside U-boat command, intelligence reports fed this confidence. The German code-breaking service, B-Dienst, had successfully penetrated certain Allied ciphers, giving early clues to routes. When U-boats found their prey exactly where expected, it seemed proof of German superiority in both courage and cunning. Few suspected that this success rested on fragile luck, nor that the Allies were already dismantling it with faster, more complex encryptions and silent deception. For now, victory looked absolute. Dönitz himself predicted Britain could be starved out before summer if the current trend continued. He ordered accelerated production of new type VII and IX submarines and pushed crews to sea faster than they could be trained. Factories worked beyond capacity. Recruit schools shortened courses. 16-year-olds volunteered, dreaming of glory under the waves. They didn't know that by signing their names, many were pledging to vanish without trace. Each night at sea, the men inside the boats followed a ritual, a brief transmission home, coded in Enigma, reporting kills and fuel levels. They believed they were whispering to a secure command post, unseen and untouchable. But every transmission also betrayed an approximate position to Allied direction-finding stations along Britain's coast. The very coordination that made the Wolfpacks deadly was also weaving the net that would soon close around them. Still, in these first months of 1943, the myth held strong. The U-boats seemed to own the Atlantic. In Berlin, Officers pinned new medals to crisp uniforms. Propaganda films showed submarines surfacing in sunlight, crews smiling atop conning towers. The image played beautifully on newsreels, but hid the truth, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, and the growing number of boats that simply didn't come back. There were quiet warnings even then. A veteran commander noted in his log that enemy aircraft were appearing more frequently farther out to sea. Another mentioned strange radar pings they couldn't trace. Reports trickled upward but were buried under triumphant communiques. The leadership saw anomalies, not patterns. Success left no room for doubt. The Atlantic, however, had begun to change character. With each sinking, Allied scientists, tacticians, and codebreakers learned more. Operations researchers charted the mathematics of convoy geometry. Engineers in Britain and America built compact radar sets capable of piercing weather and darkness. While U-boat crews reveled in their victories, their adversaries were quietly rewriting the rules. But the Wolfpack commanders didn't see that. From inside their steel vessels, they only saw the explosions, the burning ships, and the glory that followed. Their confidence became doctrine, and their doctrine became blindness. What they thought was dominance was already turning hollow, a momentary peak before the fall. In early 1943, the hunters still believed the ocean belonged to them. Dönitz called it the decisive phase. His captains toasted to final victory aboard boats that smelled of oil and sweat, unaware that the next patrols would bring the deadline of their glory. Beneath the waves, triumph drifted toward tragedy. The Wolfpacks had reached their height, and unknowingly, the summit from which they'd begin their descent. The hidden weakness in German intelligence. Inside a dimly lit bunker in Paris, operators from the German Naval Intelligence Service, Dienst, hunched over receivers, headphones pressed tight, pencils scribbling in rhythm with bursts of Morse. The intercept room pulsed with static. Somewhere in that noise lay the coordinates of Allied Convoy, lifelines that, if detected early enough, could be shattered by Dönitz's Wolfpacks. For months, Dienst had been hitting gold. They'd cracked sections of the British naval cipher number 3, deciphering fragments of convoy routes with eerie accuracy. When their decoded messages aligned with U-boat sightings at sea, the system looked flawless. Commanders called it their invisible advantage. To Dönitz, intelligence wasn't support, it was weaponry. He believed raw courage alone could never win under the Atlantic's miles deep uncertainty. Success required precision, and precision meant information. Every new decrypt from Dienst fed into the rhythm of his war map. Patrol lines shifted, submarines redirected, convoys predicted days before first contact. During early 1943, it felt near mathematical. Find the broadcast, decode the pattern, dispatch the pack, sink the tonnage. Germany appeared to be mastering the unseen layer of war. But this mastery carried a flaw buried deep within its logic. German analysts saw codebreaking as a one-way mirror. They believed they could watch the enemy without being watched themselves. That illusion would poison their judgment. As they triumphed in the cipher rooms, the Allies were learning just as fast, even faster, to pierce German communications. The secrecy Dienst relied on was already an illusion. Still, inside German Naval Command, confidence hardened into arrogance. Reports from U-boat captains confirmed what the decrypts predicted. Convoys appeared right where intelligence said they'd be. Cargo manifests turned out accurate. Every match felt like validation. No one asked how long such luck could last, or whether the enemy noticed. The statistical success gave Dönitz a dangerous conviction. If German cryptanalysts could read the British, then the British surely couldn't read them. By mid-1942, Dienst had grown bold. They were reading variations of American and British codes used for transatlantic convoys, sometimes within hours of transmission. The payoff was devastating. Merchant losses spiked, and Dönitz used those numbers to argue for expanded submarine production. But information has a half-life in war. Allied cipher officers, aware their messages were being intercepted, began rotating fresh codebooks faster than German analysts could adjust. New encryption tables appeared. Message formats subtly changed. What looked like another routine radio intercept became gibberish overnight. The shift was quiet, deliberate. The Allies didn't advertise the change, so from the German perspective, nothing was wrong. Convoy data grew inconsistent, but analysts blamed meteorological interference or late intercepts, not encryption shifts. In intelligence rooms from Paris to Kiel, technicians spent sleepless nights trying to tune receivers that no longer delivered clarity. Dönitz didn't notice the drift. His graphs still favored optimism, the early gains still disguising the fault lines forming beneath them. Meanwhile, Allied deception worked in silence. Clerks inserted small errors into dummy radio traffic, false conv, departures, misleading routing points. Dienst devoured the bait. Whole wolfpacks chased ghost formations across empty stretches of the Atlantic. Submarines burned precious fuel-shadowing ships that didn't exist. Captains blamed faulty weather predictions. Dienst blamed weak signals. Few realized the truth. They were now reading what the enemy wanted them to read. Inside the U-boats, the cracks showed differently. Patrols ended in empty water. Promised convoys never materialized. Captains filed cautious signals. Visibility poor, position uncertain, no contact after 72 hours. At headquarters, officers dismissed them. They argued that losses at sea were proof the strategy still worked, proof delivered by men already disappearing beneath the waves. Intelligence became self-referential, feeding only its own certainty. By early 1943, the divergence became critical. The Allies were drawing not from guesswork, but from ultra, decoded Enigma traffic that gave them full view of U-boat directives. Every movement Dönitz ordered, every regrouping of his patrol lines, echoed through Allied command rooms in near real time. Yet Dönitz interpreted operational failures as random misfortune. When wolfpacks arrived too late or steamrolled into ambushes, he accused his captains of error. Morale dipped. Some officers suspected that the Allies had found a way into Enigma, but suggesting it bordered on treason. To question the machine was to question the doctrine itself. The result was tragic irony. German intelligence had achieved remarkable technical skill, but failed at strategic humility. Instead of testing whether their success could be an illusion, they doubled down. When the Allies upgraded their codes and encryption, especially the US Navy's shift to more complex ciphers, Dienst's decrypt rates plummeted, but internal reports massaged the data to preserve appearances. Dönitz received summaries promising continued partial access, unaware that the channel was closing for good. At the same moment, German signal security was unraveling. The same open frequencies used for daily U-boat reports gave Allied direction finding stations precise bearings. Every message sent in triumph became a trail marker for British intercept teams. By trusting their own communications network so completely, the Germans had gifted the Allies a map of their movements. But to Dönitz and his staff, radio discipline symbolized control. They couldn't imagine adopting Allied-style compartmentalization because it clashed with the philosophy of centralized command that made wolfpacks possible. The efficiency of coordination masked its cost in exposure. The intelligence duel that once seemed evenly matched was tipping. After spring 1943, German decrypts dwindled to scraps, isolated meteorological data, outdated ship signals, nothing operationally useful. Yet Dienst continued delivering optimistic reports couched in jargon. Field commanders, desperate for usable information, filled the gaps with guesswork, sending submarines into increasingly predictable patrol routes. Those routes became ambush corridors for Allied aircraft, primed by ultra-intelligence. Inside the intelligence offices, the tone shifted. What had been frantic precision turned bureaucratic. Reports repeated patterns, rewritten from old templates. The most devastating realization, the possibility that the Allies now understood German communications better than Germany did the Allies, remained unspoken. It was easier not to see. Still, a few officers sensed collapse. They noted how quickly Allied escorts anticipated attacks, how convoys now altered courses before detection, how supply submarines, vital lifelines for distant patrols, were vanishing. They warned that the Code War might have reversed direction entirely. Their memos reached Dönitz's staff, and stopped there. Admitting that would mean admitting the entire operational model was compromised. So German intelligence carried on, hollowed by its own assumptions. Each interception, once celebrated, now mirrored back confusion. Each decrypt took longer, produced less, explained nothing. In Berlin, senior officials praised the service for its continuing contribution to victory, even as convoys crossed the Atlantic nearly unmolested. That was the hidden weakness, not incompetence, but faith. Faith that early mastery would stay permanent. Faith that the enemy couldn't innovate faster. Faith that technology, once conquered, stayed obedient. In truth, the Germans were surrounded by information they couldn't see, outsmarted by an enemy they believed inferior. Dienst's last real success had expired months before Dönitz realized he was fighting blind. The Wolfpack still prowled, but now they hunted from memory, chasing messages that no longer revealed their prey. And above them, unseen, Allied intelligence was already plotting their endings, each transmission traced, each intercept repaid. The illusion of German omniscience had finally inverted. The Watchers had become the watched. The invisible war of codes and signals. In a quiet building tucked behind Cambridge's stone walls, night never truly ended. The rooms at Bletchley Park glowed with the steady pulse of lamps, the scrape of pencils, and the soft clatter of typewriters set against the hiss of intercepted radio static. Hundreds of analysts, linguists, mathematicians, chess champions, worked in silence and secrecy. To them, the war wasn't being fought with torpedoes or bombs, but with electrically powered words. Each sequence of letters streaming across their cipher machines was a shot fired in a different kind of battle, one that no U-boat crew could see coming. By 1942, the Germans believed their communications were unbreakable. The Enigma machine had layered encryptions, changing daily, even hourly. But at Bletchley, a network of minds driven by pure obsession turned that illusion of invulnerability into their opportunity. The British called their prize Ultra. It wasn't simply a set of decrypts, it was foresight, a map of the underwater war drawn in invisible ink. Every time a U-boat sent its routine report back to command, fuel levels, patrol positions, convoy sightings, that signal became another thread Bletchley's analysts could untangle. The effect was immediate and devastating. Convoy routes once plotted by guesswork now shifted according to intelligence that seemed prophetic. If Dönitz's Wolfpacks gathered near an expected shipping lane, Allied headquarters quietly rerouted the convoy hundreds of miles off course. By the time the U-boats reached their intended ambush point, they found only open ocean. The crews, sealed in their hulls, thought fate had turned fickle. They didn't realize the enemy was reading their mail. Radio networks made it all possible, and that's where the cruel irony lived. The same elaborate communications web that allowed Dönitz to coordinate submarines across thousands of miles also exposed them. Each burst of Morse sent across the ether leaked more than data. Direction finding teams along the British coast triangulated those signals within minutes, plotting on expansive maps spread under red lights in tracking rooms. Pinpoints appeared, then converged into trails tracing every U-boat patrol. From this information, Allied planners could chart entire Wolfpack formations before they struck. Hunter-killer groups sailed for intercept points long before the submarines reached them. For the Germans, what appeared to be a stroke of bad luck, the sudden arrival of aircraft or escorts at random times, was nothing of the sort. Ultra had turned the ocean transparent. Yet the brilliance of Bletchley Park wasn't only in decoding, it was in discretion. The greatest danger was revealing what they knew. Convoys could not be diverted too perfectly, or else the Germans would suspect a leak. Analysts and admirals navigated a delicate balancing act, using intelligence enough to save lives without exposing its existence. Every decision carried human weight, when to act and risk the secret, or when to stay silent and let ships sail into danger. Strategy became morality measured in tonnage. Meanwhile, U-boat command trusted its network absolutely. Messages pulsed back and forth daily, two-way conversations between Dönitz's headquarters and captains beneath the waves. They congratulated successes, instructed repairs, even reassigned patrol grids mid-mission. Those radio bursts often lasted several minutes, an eternity for a direction-finding antenna to lock in. The Germans believed brevity codes and encryption protected them. They didn't realize each signal was a flare revealing their position. By 1943, British monitoring stations had refined the technique to ruthless precision. When a U-boat transmitted, analysts measured time of arrival differences between multiple coastal antennas. Within moments, the convergence produced an estimated fix, sometimes within 20 miles. When several messages followed in quick succession, the track sharpened. Combine that with ultra-decrypts of Dönitz's orders, and Allied strategists could predict not only where a submarine was, but where it intended to go. In essence, Dönitz was commanding from a glass room. He played his chessboard with confidence, never realizing his opponent could see every move. Each new operational order decrypted by Bletchley was telegraphed silently to the Admiralty's Western Approaches Command. From there, signals reached escort vessels instructing them to turn 20 degrees west or alter course to grid square M52. The sailors on deck followed without explanation, never told they were steering around an unseen ambush line. Under the surface, U-boats slid through empty currents, chasing echoes. The psychological toll on the German crews deepened. Patrol after patrol came back empty, fuel nearly gone, torpedoes unfired. Captains accused themselves of incompetence. Dönitz blamed weather, ocean currents, mechanical failures, anything but an intelligence failure. It seemed inconceivable that their proud encryption system, the very heart of their war, could be compromised. Pride became the slow poison that kept them blind. Inside Bletchley, the work never slowed. Messages streamed in 24 hours a day from listening posts chained across the Atlantic, Canada, Iceland, Gibraltar. The data fed back into Hut 4, where analysts sorted naval traffic. Out of endless pages of code groups, they extracted patterns, repeated coordinates, timing rhythms, circuit references. Piece by piece, they reconstructed Hitler's underwater fleet without ever leaving their desks. Every word that traveled through German radio space added another tile to the mosaic. And yet the British still took losses. Intelligence could reroute convoys, but it couldn't always protect ships caught in the open. Sometimes, Ultra came too late. Sometimes, commanders doubted its accuracy. The analysts felt the weight of those mistakes. They worked knowing that a missed intercept could mean hundreds of lives sunk in the dark before dawn. When the reports of new sinkings arrived, the cryptographers read them differently, from guilt rather than shock. But each failure sharpened the system, making the next convoy safer. Across the front lines, the invisible war of messages defined every movement. What Dönitz saw as instinct and discipline was, in reality, reaction to an opponent who already knew the answers. His wolfpacks kept reassembling into freshly compromised formations, unaware they were performing routines choreographed by their enemies. The tighter his command network became, the clearer it appeared on Allied charts. By spring 1943, ultra-intelligence guided not only convoys, but offensive operations. Hunter-killer groups patrolled suspected rendezvous zones, targeting supply submarines. The milch cows that refueled and rearmed U-boats mid-ocean. Without them, distant patrols starved of fuel and were forced home, cutting Germany's reach in half. Each successful strike shrank the Wolfpack's footprint. For the men at sea, none of this had visible form. They felt only that something terrifying had changed. Captains' logs described phantom awareness, the sense of being followed though no ship could be seen. Radios grew quiet, orders shortened, signal discipline tightened out of fear. Still, it made no difference. The Allies didn't need more messages. They already knew enough. The tide of secrecy had reversed completely. German command believed they operated through secure lightning. Instead, their every spark was captured and mirrored. The architecture of their own coordination had become a weapon against them. Every victory at sea, every daring interception, was guided by a world of machines, mathematicians, and clerks working beyond the sound of gunfire. While Dönitz mapped his ocean in squares labeled with letters and numbers, the Allies were redrawing it in code chains and radio bearings. For all his brilliance, he was now an open book being read one page ahead. The Wolfpack still lurked beneath the waves, but the battlefield had expanded beyond their depth. Their torpedoes couldn't reach the cipher rooms or the flickering cathode screens of radar operators. There, the war was already decided. The hunters, still confident in their steel, were now pursuing phantoms shaped by their own messages. The Atlantic had turned into an echo chamber where every word bounced back with deadly accuracy. And in that quiet triumph of logic over secrecy, the seeds of the U-boat empire's destruction took root, not with explosions or heroics, but with sentences, keys, and signals whispered across the void. Sky against sea, the arrival of airborne radar. By the spring of 1943, the ocean that once protected the U-boats had turned against them. The first sign came not from sight or sound, but from the electric hum of a small box bolted to the hull, the Metoc's radar warning receiver. When it screamed, crews had only seconds to react. The alarm meant that somewhere above the cloudline, an Allied aircraft had found them, at night, in fog, sometimes hundreds of miles from land. To German commanders, it felt like black magic. In truth, it was something far simpler but far deadlier: centimetric radar. Only a year earlier, the U-boats could surface under cover of darkness to recharge their batteries, watch the horizon, and breathe unchallenged. Aircraft posed no real threat at night. Their crude radar could barely detect a surface target beyond a few miles. The ocean was infinite, the darkness their shield. But then came a revolution small enough to fit in a bomber's nose: the new air-to-surface vessel radar, operating at 10-centimeter wavelengths. Unlike older metric sets, this one could pierce fog, rain, even the curve of the sea. To radar operators peering at glowing screens, a U-boat on the surface now appeared as a bright spark against black. There was no hiding anymore. Each night the Atlantic grew smaller. Patrol aircraft flew in arcs from Greenland to the Azores, their radars sweeping like silent searchlights. When a signal returned, crews dropped altitude fast, closing in for the kill. The U-boat's first hint came when the Metoc's receiver began to tick, a ghostly heartbeat warning of radar waves. Those few seconds of grace were everything. If the commander dived in time, survival was possible. If not, a blinding illumination ripped through the darkness. That light had a name: the Leigh Light. Mounted under the wings of British patrol planes, it switched on automatically once radar locked onto a target. Pilots described the moment as searing, as if they'd torn the night open. For the submariners below, it was pure terror. 1 second of glare was often followed by the splash of depth charges. The same ocean that once offered sanctuary now reflected their own destruction. Dönitz's headquarters tried to decode the pattern. Reports from returning captains described surprise attacks far from known patrol areas. Invisible aircraft, some wrote, appear out of darkness. The phrasing sounded superstitious, but to the men who lived through it, there was no other explanation. The Kriegsmarine's technical staff would later learn that Allied scientists had achieved the impossible: radar undetectable by the Metoc system. Every advance in German detection had already been outpaced. To counter, engineers rushed a new detector, Naxos, into production. It could sense higher frequency radar pulses, but its range was short, its response unreliable. By the time it reached operational boats, its advantage was as thin as the atmosphere above them. The radar race had turned into pursuit, one side innovating, the other improvising. Meanwhile, the Allies added new weapons to complete the circle. Aircraft no longer had to rely solely on depth charges. They carried the Fido air-dropped acoustic torpedo. It listened for the hum of propellers under the surface and curved toward its prey. Old depth charges had only a single chance: Fido could follow. Its success rate, roughly 1 in 5, dwarfed traditional methods. To the U-boat crews, that statistic translated into dread. Diving no longer guaranteed safety. More devastating still was how Allied air and sea forces learned to combine their power. Hunter-killer groups, teams of destroyers and patrol aircraft acting as one, stalked the ocean's gridlines relentlessly. They didn't wait for an attack. They searched, pinned, and struck, turning the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a killing field where the Germans were always a few minutes behind. The psychological effect was devastating. Submariners began surfacing only at the edge of exhaustion, desperate for air but terrified of detection. Some kept watch in total darkness, scanning the sky for silhouettes they could never see. Any faint radio hum or flicker on the Metoc's needle could launch panic. Crewmen spoke of phantom aircraft, false alarms that sent boats diving so often they barely advanced on their patrols. The pressure hulls creaked, batteries wore out, nerves frayed. For the first time since the war began, the North Atlantic sky belonged to the Allies. What once seemed an infinite expanse was now a combat zone mapped by invisible beams. Long-range liberators filled the air gap that had been the U-boats, haven between Iceland and the Azores. These heavy aircraft could patrol for hours, guided by radar operators who spotted periscopes as easily as ships. Convoys that once crossed unguarded now sailed under a watchful canopy. The ocean surface turned into a death zone for submarines. In Admiral Dönitz seethed. He argued the losses were temporary, a fluctuation in tides. Yet even he sensed the shift. In April alone, more U-boats failed to return than in any month before. Every technological countermeasure proposed by his engineers arrived too slowly. The Allies were out-producing, out-detecting, and out-thinking his fleet. The invisible war of electrons was one he could neither see nor understand. To bridge the gap, he ordered changes to tactics: daytime running submerged, surfacing only after dark, transmission silence except in emergencies. But that strategy crippled his boats. Submerged travel meant slower speeds and limited range. Communication silence destroyed coordination. What kept them alive also kept them ineffective. Meanwhile, Allied pilots grew confident. They nicknamed the patrols witch hunts, no longer missions of chance but of certainty. When radar locked and the Leigh Light snapped on, they didn't question the kill. U-boats trying to crash dive were often caught mid-descent, their sterns sliced by explosions before they reached depth. Survivors surfaced hours later, clinging to oil-slick waves, watching aircraft circles vanish into daylight. The shift from dominance to despair happened in months. At the start of 1943, U-boats prowled the Atlantic like ghosts. By summer, they were hunted from both sky and sea. Every new technology compounded their helplessness. Radar that pierced night, ships with forward-throwing weapons, torpedoes that listened underwater. The men in Berlin still quoted tonnage charts, but at sea, commanders measured reality in sinkings of their own boats. The balance of fear had reversed. Allied crews once feared surfacing in mid-ocean. Now the submariners dreaded every ascent. A world they thought ruled by stealth had become transparent. The ocean no longer whispered secrets. It screamed them through radar echoes. Each patrol returned fewer victories, more survivors shell-shocked by invisible enemies. Inside the pressure hulls, silence grew heavier than depth itself. Veterans remarked that by the time their detectors warned them, it was already over. They weren't exaggerating. Microwave radar didn't give warnings, it gave coordinates. In the war's turning year, the sky had conquered the sea. The technological frontier that Germany once led now belonged to its enemies. Air power had eroded the myth of U-boat invincibility one pulse at a time. By the time Dönitz realized that dominance required eyes in the sky, his submarines were already blind. The hunters were learning to hide, surfacing only briefly, creeping through shallows, haunted by every flick of static. The very brilliance that had built their empire, the belief that innovation was fixed once achieved, had chained them to outdated tools. Allied radar had rewritten the ocean, and the Germans were reading from an obsolete map. In the glow of those airborne screens, the Atlantic revealed its new truth. There would be no safe darkness, no final refuge. The sea itself had joined the enemy. The Convoy Revolution. By the middle of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer an unstructured hunting ground. It had become a vast laboratory of survival. The transformation was quiet, rooted not in speeches, but in calculations scratched across chalkboards. While the U-boats prowled beneath the waves, British analysts above them were redefining how the ocean itself was fought. They called it operations research, a discipline where mathematics and probability dictated strategy more reliably than instinct ever could. Out of that science grew the Convoy Revolution. At the start of the war, Allied convoys moved cautiously, small clusters of merchant ships guarded by a handful of overworked escorts. The intent was defensive: move quietly, avoid attention, minimize losses. But data told a different story. Statisticians noticed that the fewer ships grouped together, the easier they were to find. Each conv operated like a glowing target in the ocean, and multiple small formations gave the Germans multiple chances of success. When analysts measured risk mathematically, the results were shocking. One large conv with a single escort screen was statistically safer than several smaller ones. Size, paradoxically, meant security. So the British and Americans rewrote the playbook. Massive convoys of 40, 60, even 100 ships began to cross the Atlantic in tightly controlled columns. At a glance, they looked clumsy, slow, heavy, too large to maneuver. But to U-boat commanders, the sight was overwhelming. A single Wolfpack could no longer encircle such formations, and the enlarged perimeter meant escorts had greater opportunity to detect incoming submarines with sonar and radar sweeps. What appeared a lumbering target was, in fact, an armored phalanx of logistics. Each ship within the formation followed precise navigation orders. 1,000 yards between columns, 600 between vessels, speeds synchronized to the slowest craft. Vulnerable tankers and ammunition carriers nestled at the center, shielded by freighters tougher to sink. Surrounding them, warships cruised in constant arcs, depth charges primed, sonar pinging through the black water. Beneath those disciplined lines, an invisible barrier of mathematics was forming, a geometry of survival built on observation and sacrifice. Yet even this structure meant nothing without eyes in the sky. The central torment of the early Atlantic campaign had been the air gap, a void in mid-ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft. There, U-boats struck freely, surfacing by day, stalking by night. That gap had always been Dönitz's playground. The Conv revolution closed it. Small escort carriers, improvised from converted merchant hulls, brought aircraft directly into the heart of the convoys. They were ungainly ships, little more than flat decks bolted onto narrow frames, but they carried the promise of continuous air cover. Each launch meant radar scans hundreds of miles wide. Each patrol signaled that no part of the ocean was unreachable anymore. Pilots flew arcs around the convoys, watching for periscopes, oil slicks, or the faint silhouette of a conning tower. A contact meant immediate response. The carrier formations didn't need to wait for reinforcements. Air power had become inherent to the convoy itself. For the first time, the Atlantic crossing turned from reaction to initiative. Instead of absorbing attacks, escorts began dictating terms. When a U-boat was spotted, destroyers coded the bearing into shortwave transmissions and sprinted outward in coordinated patterns. While one vessel maintained sonar contact, others advanced to box the submarine in. It was not chaos, but choreography. At the head of this change was Commander Frederick Johnny Walker, a Royal Navy officer with an instinct for turning science into aggression. His Western Approaches tactical unit taught crews to act as hunters, not guards. Walker's groups didn't circle convoys protectively. They peeled away to pursue contacts miles beyond the horizon. He trained his crews to maintain relentless pressure, alternating depth charge patterns, timing drops so no submarine could surface to breathe. His doctrine was brutal and effective: make the ocean unlivable for the enemy. The results were immediate. In early 1943, convoys that had once suffered devastating losses began to arrive intact. Where 10 merchant ships might previously vanish, now one was lost, or none. Escort groups coordinated attacks that lasted hours, sometimes days, until an oil slick rose like proof of a kill. U-boat commanders found their tactics collapsing. Every torpedo fired brought a swarm of destroyers racing toward its origin. The balance of courage shifted. Behind these victories stood a quiet partnership between intelligence and mathematics. Allied direction finding stations fed Conv command with near real-time bearings of German transmissions. Operations researchers analyzed those reports, adjusting routes to skirt known patrol lines. Weather data, decoded messages, and radar coverage zones all merged into a dynamic system. The convoys had become organisms, self-correcting, learning, and responding faster than any admiral could by instinct alone. Dönitz's centralized command now looked sluggish by comparison. Even the men who sailed within the convoys felt the difference. Merchant crews who once feared the isolation of darkness now saw aircraft lights circling overhead. The sound of escort engines brought comfort rather than alarm. Morale soared. They sensed, perhaps without understanding the details, that the tide had shifted. The hunters were being hunted. Meanwhile, U-boat crews confronted an entirely new kind of enemy. When they attempted to penetrate a convoy screen, they met a wall of disciplined fire. Destroyers no longer chased sonar echoes randomly. They plotted contact trails using triangulation data linked by radio coordination. The Germans had no equivalent network. Each submarine fought alone, bound by silence to avoid detection. Against a machine, this integrated, individual heroism counted for nothing. The convoy revolution wasn't glamorous. It didn't rely on secret weapons or dramatic breakthroughs. It was built on measurement, patience, and trust in data. Yet it rewired the entire Atlantic War. Through it, technology translated into doctrine. Radar revealed, sonar confirmed, air power struck, and operations research united them all. By mid-year, the statistics spoke a language U-boat command could no longer ignore. The ratio of ships sunk to U-boats lost flipped completely. Where once each submarine could expect to destroy multiple targets per patrol, by summer 1943, the average return was less than one. Meanwhile, Allied production replaced every lost ship faster than Germany could sink it. The mathematics that had once doomed Britain now sentenced the U-boats. Still, the transformation wasn't purely analytic. It depended on human endurance. The escort crews who spent weeks in freezing seas, rotating between sonar watches and crash responses, living in constant vibration from their own depth charges. The data they collected in chaos became the foundation of refined tactics taught back on shore. Every patrol improved the next. The system learned faster than it bled. From above, the pattern looked almost inevitable. Convoys moving like armored caravans, hunter-killer groups weaving among them, aircraft casting invisible nets of radar across the gaps. But within that order was something deeper, a philosophical inversion. German doctrine worshipped decisive strikes by elite captains. The Allied system thrived on collective adaptation. No single miracle turned the war. Coordination itself became the miracle. By late 1943, Dönitz's hunters faced fleets that had grown minds of their own, networks of humans and machines reacting in perfect unity. The Atlantic, once a chessboard for ambushes, had transformed into a battlefield of pursuit. Each convoy crossed not as prey, but as the spearhead of an algorithm tuned by experience. The age of lone wolves was over. The pack that now ruled the ocean sailed above the surface. The March 1943 crisis. March 1943 began with confidence and ended in catastrophe. Across the North Atlantic, 40 German submarines assembled for the largest coordinated attack of the war. It was Dönitz's grand gamble, a strike meant to finish what years of tonnage warfare had promised. Two massive Allied convoys, HX-229 and SC-122, were westbound in parallel lanes, a combined fleet of over 100 merchant ships escorted by barely a dozen warships. Dönitz saw them as the perfect target, huge, slow, and well within range of his patrol lines. To every crew preparing to sail, the message from command was clear: this would be decisive. The storm began on March 16. A U-boat under Captain Gerd Kelbling sighted the lead convoy through rough seas and sent out the call. One after another, submarines shifted course toward the coordinates, their radio messages bursting across the ether like flares. In Kerneval, Dönitz watched pins swarm across the operations map, lines converging, the Wolfpack forming exactly as planned. The plan was named Hecht, the Pike Attack. For the German Navy, it was the culmination of everything they'd built. Precise coordination, overwhelming force, the promise of annihilation. Nightfall transformed that confidence into chaos. The convoys were plowing through gale-force winds, decks slick, waves cresting 30 feet high. Radar sweeps struggled in the weather. Escorts fought to maintain formation. Then, beneath the storm, sonar operators caught faint contacts, multiple echoes, closing fast. Within minutes, the convoy's perimeter erupted. Torpedoes slammed into the outer columns, rupturing fuel tanks and lighting the sea gold. One by one, red flares burst through the night, distress signals vanishing beneath smoke and rain. The attacking submarines worked in rhythm. They surfaced amid the destruction, firing from among the merchant columns themselves. Some captains navigated by the burning ship's glow. Explosions rolled across the storm, echoing between waves. Allied destroyers dropped depth charges blindly offshore, but the ocean seemed filled with shadows. By dawn, 12 ships were gone. News of the assault reached London by radio fragment. Admiralty communications scrambled to redirect escort reinforcements, but the mid-Atlantic was an island of chaos. Dönitz's staff received jubilant reports. Targets struck repeatedly, convoy disorganized. They didn't know that the same storm that hid the attackers also crippled them. Many submarines, unable to maintain depth in the turbulence, were forced to surface amid wreckage, vulnerable to gunfire from stragglers still afloat. Several never re-established contact. On March 18, HX-229 and SC-122, now running nearly parallel, were ordered to merge, an unprecedented maneuver under fire. The surviving escorts tried to herd the battered merchant ships together into a single defended group. To Allied crews, it felt like gathering wounded animals. But as the fleets closed ranks, the Wolfpack struck again. 9 more ships went under that night. Some sank so quickly their crews never reached lifeboats. Within 4 days, 21 Allied vessels lay at the bottom. For a fleeting moment, it looked like Dönitz had delivered his promised victory. In London, shipping losses rattled Parliament. Newspapers whispered of a return to the dark days of 1941. The Ministry of War Transport spoke of unacceptable attrition. Even Churchill admitted to colleagues that the convoy system might be failing. Yet beneath the statistics, something fundamental had changed. Success had come at an unbearable cost. Industrial arithmetic had sealed the fate of Dönitz's fleet. By 1943, Germany could produce only about 20 new U-boats a month, while American shipyards were launching hundreds of Liberty and Victory ships in the same span, replacing every loss several times over. For every Allied vessel sunk, 2 more left port within weeks. The tonnage curve that once promised victory now mocked the U-boat charts with impossible numbers. The U-boats that survived the assault limped home through storm-torn seas, haunted by the same weather that had saved them. Hurricanes scattered the Wolfpacks, drove several boats onto unintended courses, and forced emergency dives that damaged hulls. More crucially, every radio report they transmitted during the chaos had been intercepted. British naval intelligence triangulated those signals, feeding fresh coordinates into Bletchley Park's decrypt system. Within weeks, Ultra would reveal the exact contours of Dönitz's command network. What seemed a triumph was in fact a confession broadcast across the Atlantic. At Naval, Dönitz interpreted the setbacks as operational friction. Losses were rising, but morale still floated on the March tonnage reports. 71 Allied ships destroyed in a single month, almost half in the convoys themselves. The numbers looked like vindication. To the submarine crews, though, the tone felt different. Boat after boat returned with missing officers, wrecked periscopes, exhausted men. Some captains filed quiet notes about new radar contacts far from shore, aircraft appearing from impossible distances. Others described charges dropped with unheard of precision, as if the enemy knew exactly where they'd be. The complaints never reached summary reports. Staff filtered them as anecdotal. While Dönitz celebrated his tactical brilliance, his fleet was hemorrhaging. Nearly half the boats engaged in the March operations failed to report home. Others arrived crippled. Replacement crews, trained in haste, lacked the instincts of veterans lost at sea. The empire of experience was thinning. Each new submarine required men pulled from the shrinking pool of survivors. The more triumph he announced, the fewer he actually commanded. The Allied reaction was immediate. Convoy escort groups experimented with new coordination protocols, shortwave instructions that allowed destroyers and corvettes to maneuver independently rather than staying bound to rigid screens. Within days, these tactics evolved into proto-hunter-killer formations. Losses from the March battles spurred a flood of resources: more aircraft, more escort carriers, more scientific oversight. The crisis became a catalyst. Yet in that same month, Germany crossed an invisible threshold. For the first time, more U-boats were sunk than Allied ships. 28 submarines failed to return from March patrols. In Dönitz's charts, it was a small line of red figures. In reality, it marked the beginning of collapse. Each lost crew meant 50 men entombed forever, 50 who wouldn't train replacements, 50 whose experience would vanish into salt water. Inside the U-boat force, rumors spread. Crews whispered that the Atlantic had changed, that Allied planes could see through clouds, that sonar pings were sharper than before. Veterans from earlier patrols found the new battles mechanical, one-sided. "We no longer hunt," one officer wrote. "We are the wounded that keep swimming." But such voices never left personal journals. Official reports spoke only of temporary setbacks and unfavorable weather. Allied codebreakers watching from their quiet stations saw the opposite: a fleet disintegrating in slow motion. The wolfpacks that once formed with deadly precision now moved irregularly, their signals hesitant, fragmented. For analysts at Bletchley Park, that fragmentation was proof of victory, still invisible to the front lines. Each intercepted burst during the March battle had fed directly into counter-operations that would, by May, devastate the U-boat command beyond recovery. Dönitz refused to see it. He believed the March offensive validated the core of his doctrine, that decisive massed attacks could still overwhelm Allied escorts. What he didn't grasp was that this offensive had revealed every secret of how his fleet fought. The Allies had studied it like scientists analyzing a specimen under glass. The weather that saved the convoys had also preserved their survivors, witnesses who would refine the next convoy strategies. March 1943 became both a catastrophe and a revelation. When the month ended, morale inside Germany's submarine corps stood on a knife edge. Official propaganda hailed the destruction of Allied tonnage, but in mess halls and dockyards, silence lingered over missing comrades. Each new patrol felt like a sentence. The captains still saluted Dönitz's orders out of duty, but many understood the reality behind the numbers. They were expending men faster than they could sink ships. The March crisis was not just another battle. It was the tipping point where triumph turned cannibalistic. Every success consumed its own future. Collision with improved Allied technology was now inevitable, yet German command would meet it with faith rather than adaptation. The wolfpacks had bitten deep, but the wound they inflicted would bleed them dry. In claiming victory, they'd written the obituary of their own army beneath the very waves that once made them powerful. The Allied counteroffensive. By the spring of 1943, the war in the Atlantic no longer followed the same rhythm. For 3 years, Allied forces had reacted, patching holes, rerouting convoys, playing defense against an invisible enemy. Now the pattern changed direction. The hunted had become the hunters. The Allied counteroffensive didn't begin with a declaration. It began quietly as escort ships tightened ranks and air patrols fanned outward. The shift was psychological first, then strategic. Destroyer escorts newly launched from American shipyards filled the ports of Britain in endless grey rows. Each one carried improved sonar, depth charges, and radar sets tuned to centimetric wavelengths. But the real breakthrough wasn't the ships themselves, it was how they were used. The concept of the hunter-killer group emerged. Surface vessels and aircraft working together to find and destroy submarines, whether convoys were threatened or not. No longer bound to protective duty, these formations roamed like predators across designated sectors of the Atlantic, guided by intelligence and armed with relentless patience. The logic was simple. Every U-boat sunk before reaching its hunting zone saved countless ships down the line. The execution, however, demanded unprecedented coordination between air and sea units. Long-range patrol aircraft acted as the hunters' eyes. Destroyers became their claws. When an aircraft radar picked up a contact, it radioed coordinates to the closest escort group. Within minutes, sonar operators aboard surface vessels scanned the same patch of ocean, seeking the faint echo of a submerged hull. Once detected, there was no respite. The weapons had evolved too, Standard depth charges were effective but imprecise. They exploded behind the target after a brief guess and prey interval. The introduction of Hedgehog projectors changed that. Mounted on the bows of escort ships, these devices launched patterns of small exploders forward, detonating only upon impact. It was like throwing a volley of spears instead of dropping barrels. For submariners, the difference was merciless. Hedgehog strikes often meant instant annihilation before any evasive maneuver could begin. Further out, escort carriers turned the air above the fleets into an extension of the sea battle. Compact but lethal, they hosted squadrons of swordfish and avengers equipped with radar and depth bombs. The hunter-killer groups revolving around these carriers became mobile fortresses covering thousands of square miles each week. When a U-boat surfaced to recharge, an aircraft might appear seemingly from nowhere, guided by the unseen vectors of decoded transmissions. By May, the effectiveness of this combined approach became irrefutable. In a single month, Allied forces destroyed 41 U-boats, nearly a third of Germany's active Atlantic fleet. German reports described unprecedented accuracy of counterattacks as if chance alone explained it. They suspected new technology but missed the larger truth. Their enemy had moved beyond defense entirely. Inside Western Approach's command, the coordination reached an almost musical level of precision. Intelligence from Bletchley Park streamed across desks hourly. Conv, positions, U-boat sightings, radar tracks, all were layered into continuous updates to field commanders. Decision-making flattened. Local captains no longer waited for distant orders. Decentralized autonomy let them act the instant they scented opportunity. The rigid hierarchies that once slowed Allied responses had dissolved into a fluent, adaptive network. It was as though the ocean itself had acquired nerves. This transformation didn't happen by inspiration, it happened by necessity. Each failure before 1943 had convinced the Allies that the only path to survival was cooperation between realms that once competed for control. Intelligence officers, aviators, ship commanders, scientists, and mathematicians. Their merger produced something new, a multi-domain warfare system before the term even existed. The Germans still measured strength by tonnage and number of hulls. The Allies measured it by data flow. At sea, this new philosophy materialized through sound and light. Sonar pings beat at regular intervals, a metronome marking the search. Pilots above tracked the shimmer of oil slicks, calling vectors as destroyers below aligned their attacks. Everything was synchronized, almost mechanical, yet powered by human intuition. When a hedgehog pattern finally found its mark, the explosion didn't just destroy steel, it signaled the end of German dominance. U-boat crews were the first to notice. Patrol logs revealed a growing sense of hopelessness. Enemy ahead, impossible to evade, one commander wrote after evading pursuit for 12 hours before being finished by charges dropped with surgical precision. Others described aircraft that appeared minutes after surfacing, regardless of weather. Word spread through the fleet that the Allies possessed eyes in the clouds. What they didn't know was that those eyes belonged as much to cryptographers as to pilots. Every intercepted transmission mapped their routes. On the Allied side, confidence finally replaced dread. Sailors who once feared sonar echoes now chased them eagerly. Success bred morale, and morale fed efficiency. Escort commanders began competing for confirmed kills, though the tone remained grimly professional. Each sinking represented dozens of enemy sailors drowning, but it also meant fewer torpedoes threatening the convoys that sustained armies in North Africa and Europe. The Atlantic was no longer a slow bleed. It was the bloodstream of an advancing war. Still, victory carried its own pressure. Each hunter-killer patrol demanded endurance from crews working at the edge of exhaustion. Navies stretched training programs to keep pace with ship production, and new technologies arrived faster than manuals could be written. The rapid evolution of tactics sometimes caused deadly confusion. Premature detonations, collisions during tight pursuits, aircraft diving through their own depth charge patterns. The counteroffensive was efficient, but it wasn't tidy. By late summer, patterns emerged. Submarines attempting to approach convoys were intercepted far from their targets. Radar contact led to attack to destruction. In August alone, U-Boat Command lost 30 boats. Dönitz realized the attrition curve had inverted. The more submarines he sent, the more he lost. Yet his doctrine allowed no retreat. He called it permanent offensive posture, though by then offense had become survival repackaged as courage. Back in Britain, Allied strategists recognized the symbolic weight of this reversal. For the first time since 1939, the Atlantic seemed navigable without constant fear. Supply ships flowed toward the invasion build-up in the Mediterranean, and the Soviet Union's lifelines through Arctic convoys held steady. Each ton of cargo landed safely at port was a quiet rebuttal to years of terror beneath the waves. The counteroffensive reached its peak when escort carrier groups began hunting along the Bay of Biscay, the U-boat's own doorstep. Aircraft strafed submarines leaving and entering their pens. Radar traced them even beyond coastal waters. The thought of fatal attack before open sea shattered the myth of invulnerability. German ports once considered sanctuaries became traps. In those months, the logic of war turned inside out. The technical edge, once German pride, belonged wholly to the Allies. Their system functioned less like a fleet and more like an algorithm, collecting input, processing threats, iterating tactics in real time. Dönitz's centralized command, bound by secrecy and delay, couldn't compete. He watched his U-boats vanish and ordered more built, never grasping that he was feeding a machine designed to consume them faster than he could replace them. From the outside, it seemed the ocean had gone silent, free again for commerce and troops. But silence doesn't mean peace. Beneath that calm lay wreckage, hundreds of pressure hulls crushed by a network of enemies that thought faster than any admiral. The Allied counteroffensive had done more than destroy submarines. It had proven a new truth of modern warfare. Information coordinated across domains outweighed any single weapon. To the men who fought it, the shift was tangible. Where once they'd waited for radar alarms with clenched fists, now they listened for them with purpose. Each blip was no longer a warning of imminent loss, but a signal that the initiative was theirs again. And somewhere far below, the last U-boats still on patrol heard those same signals as their death knell. The Atlantic had turned from their empire into their executioner. The collapse of the U-boat empire. By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic had changed its allegiance. The same waters that once carried the promise of German victory now swallowed their submarines whole. Each patrol that left the pens at Lorient or St. Nazaire returned thinner, quieter, or not at all. The men still spoke of Glucklich jagged, good hunting, but their voices lacked conviction. The steel hulls that once symbolized mastery now carried the weight of doom. The empire of U-boats hadn't been defeated in one decisive battle. It was dissolving voyage by voyage. The statistics drew a ruthless line through Dönitz's ambitions. In May alone, 43 submarines were destroyed. By year's end, that number had passed 200. The equation that had sustained the German strategy, tonnage sunk versus boats lost, had inverted beyond repair. The Atlantic was no longer a chessboard. It was a graveyard. Yet in Berlin, charts kept appearing on Dönitz's desk, showing tonnage gains and new submarines under construction. He pressed on, as if persistence itself could resurrect logic. To the men at sea, no graph could disguise reality. Each dive felt riskier, each surfacing a coin flip. Crews who once sang proudly while loading torpedoes now paused at the sound of engines overhead. The rituals of confidence faded. Logbooks grew terse, contact lost, depth charges close, battery damage severe. Many patrols ended without a single attack launched. Submarines reduced to fleeing from invisible hunters. By midsummer, commanders admitted privately that survival had become victory enough. Inside the boats, despair lived in every corner. The recycled air tasted of oil and fear. Batteries leaked fumes, condensation dripped constantly from the ceiling. We choked more from dread than from carbon dioxide, one mechanic later recalled. The silence of a crash dive was no longer thrilling. It was suffocating suspense, waiting for the next pattern of depth charges to break the hull. Crewmen measured time by explosions, not by clocks. When Allied aircraft forced them under, the nights offered no rest. The new radar rendered the surface as lethal as the depth. Surfacing for air or to recharge batteries meant flirting with death. Commanders began running submerged for entire days, crawling through darkness at 5 knots. Diesel fumes clung to their skin, hair fell out from exhaustion. Every U-boat became both weapon and coffin. At command headquarters, dispatches grew grim. Officers compiled losses with mechanical detachment. Boat U-353, missing since June 2. U-564, no further contact, presumed destroyed. The list extended daily. Dönitz, outwardly defiant, issued statements proclaiming that new models would restore balance. The Type Roman 21, faster and capable of deeper dives. Engineers hurried sketches through bureaucratic channels, but construction lagged months behind disaster. Germany was trying to invent its way out of extinction. Strategically, the collapse revealed how brittle success had been. The entire system depended on coordinated radio traffic between headquarters and boats. Those transmissions, once the bloodstream of the fleet, had become open wounds. Allied direction-finding stations picked up every attempt at communication. Each new order from Naval betrayed another patrol position. In a grotesque inversion, the network that had made the Wolfpacks fearsome was now the reason they were dying. Dönitz faced an impossible dilemma. To preserve discipline, messages had to continue. To preserve secrecy, they had to stop. Either choice spelled paralysis. He chose denial, rebrand retreat as tactical adjustment. In August 1943, he ordered a temporary withdrawal from the North Atlantic, calling it a strategic pause. The phrase barely masked reality. The Kriegsmarine had lost command of the ocean entirely. Inside Germany, propaganda refused to acknowledge it. Newsreels still showed submariners smiling as they stepped aboard gleaming decks, narrators praising their courage. In truth, few wanted reassignment to U-boat duty anymore. Recruitment posters promised glory beneath the waves. Sailors joked that the posters forgot to mention burial. Out of 39,000 men who had served, nearly 30,000 were already dead or missing. A generation had been consumed by the very environment that once empowered them. For survivors, the emotional collapse ran deeper than fear. It was exhaustion stripped of meaning. Veterans who had once laughed through bombardments now entered port mute, unable to meet the eyes of new recruits. Some refused medals, others hid them. "We were heroes only until we returned," one officer wrote, "and then they wished we hadn't survived to tell the story." The romance of the silent service rotted into trauma. The Allies, now dominant, pursued the campaign mercilessly. Hunter-killer groups patrolled the Bay of Biscay day and night, bombing U-boats as they tried to leave their pens. Aircraft fitted with radar swept in low at dawn, dropping depth charges almost as soon as submarines cleared the harbor mouth. Coastal defenses could do nothing. The air was Allied territory. The psychological effect was catastrophic. Crews began crossing themselves before diving, an act once discouraged as superstition. Even within headquarters, faith fractured. Junior officers whispered that perhaps radio silence should be total, that wolfpacks were obsolete, that survival depended on decentralizing command. But hierarchy strangled innovation. Dönitz's doctrine had built the fleet. To question it felt like betrayal. Instead, the command doubled down on rhetoric about endurance, loyalty, and sacrifice. They called it Ehrenpflicht, duty of honor. Behind the phrase hid a simple truth: there were no alternatives left. By late summer, the ocean told its own story. Allied sonar operators reported contacts so frequent they had to prioritize which to chase. The Atlantic route to Britain, once perilous, now pulsed with unbroken supply convoys. Meanwhile, U-boat pens stayed half empty. The few boats that ventured out did so knowing they'd probably not return. Some patrols ended without encountering a single enemy ship. Only air patrols that forced them back under, nibbling fuel until they had to retreat. The empire of the U-boats had always been built on numbers. Tonnage sunk per month, new boats commissioned, operational availability. Those metrics vanished into absurdity when losses outpaced launches. Factories launched submarines directly into strategy's grave. Within months, what had been Germany's most feared weapon was functionally broken, an echo of its own legend. For the men still fighting, betrayal felt personal. They had believed in technology, discipline, secrecy. Instead, each turned against them. Radar exposed them. Enigma deceived them. Doctrine forbade them from evolving. Every patrol became a reenactment of past glory ending in silence. One surviving captain described it best. We were trapped by victory. The things that once kept us alive became the reasons we died. As 1943 closed, the withdrawal was explicit. Dönitz ordered most operational boats north to Norwegian bases, far from Allied air corridors. The North Atlantic, the heart of his once invincible theater, was abandoned. There was no announcement, no flag lowered, nothing official. Just empty sea where wolfpacks had prowled. The Germans called it reorganization. Allied sailors called it relief. From above, the Atlantic returned to commerce, but beneath its surface lay wreckage marking every stage of overconfidence. Pressure hulls littered the seabed, eerily intact, crews entombed where they'd fallen. In those twisted corridors of steel rested the cost of arrogance disguised as triumph. The supposed victory campaign had devoured its own creators. By the war's midpoint, the U-boat fleet no longer shaped history, it illustrated it. Its rise and collapse traced the curve of a single human flaw, believing that early success proves permanence. The German command mistook dominance for destiny and precision for invulnerability. When the tide reversed, they found themselves defending not the ocean, but the myth of their own infallibility. What survived of their once feared armada wasn't an empire, it was silence. Beneath the waves, that silence endures, not heroic, not tragic, simply final. The ocean that once carried their dreams of mastery had accepted its tribute. They wanted to rule the deep, instead they became part of it. The betrayal within victory. When Admiral Dönitz first reviewed the U-boat campaign's success charts, he didn't see danger, he saw validation. Every spike in Allied shipping losses confirmed what he already believed, that his theory of concentrated submarine warfare worked perfectly. To him, the Atlantic numbers weren't statistics, they were vindication. In those months before collapse, he mistook temporary dominance for proof of destiny. Each victory report, each ton of Allied cargo sunk, hardened an illusion that would soon betray him completely. The betrayal began quietly, inside the logic of the system itself. The U-boat command measured success by output, sinkings, transmissions, formation sizes, but never by adaptability. Dönitz's faith was absolute. If something worked once, it would keep working forever. The Wolfpack model had triumphed through coordination and courage, so any setback must only mean more of both were needed. When losses surged, headquarters interpreted them as misfortune, not a changing battlefield. The leadership's confidence became armor against reality, an armor that couldn't float. At the heart of that hubris lay Germany's worship of precision. Dönitz saw war as engineering, everything calculable, controllable, rational. His submarines represented that belief to perfection, machines built to exacting standards, crews drilled into synchronization. Yet war had already shifted to a different geometry. The Allies had moved from machines to systems, from singular excellence to collective adaptation. Their convoys were networks, their hunters data-driven. Dönitz couldn't grasp that complexity could defeat craftsmanship. From the German perspective, the early campaigns proved individuality. Heroic commanders like Otto Kretschmer or Günther Prien became legends, their names spread through propaganda reels and training manuals. The idea was simple. One brilliant commander could change the war. But out in the Atlantic of 1943, brilliance was obsolete. Systems, not heroes, decided outcomes. No ace could outthink radar. No captain could outmaneuver Ultra. No tactic could compensate for being predicted a week in advance. The Germans kept fighting yesterday's war out of yesterday's pride. This strategic myopia infected every level of command. When the Allies unveiled airborne radar, German analysts labeled it a temporary advantage, something technology would soon counter. When codebreakers failed, they blamed unlucky intercepts, not the closing of an entire intelligence front. Even as patrols returned shattered, headquarter briefings stressed optimism. Dönitz refused to revise doctrine because revision meant admitting the foundation had cracked. To maintain authority, he converted evidence of failure into faith in endurance. If losses rose, It only confirmed his men's sacrifice for the fatherland. Inside the boats, the dissonance grew unbearable. Captains were told that new radio discipline and improved torpedo tactics would reverse fortunes, but no adjustment could offset what had already shifted in physics and intelligence. Allied aircraft simply saw too far. Their networks reacted too fast. Submariners living through escalating disaster didn't see divine destiny. They saw command denial. Still, they obeyed, believing loyalty could substitute for strategy. The Germans had always portrayed themselves as masters of initiative, yet by 1943 they operated entirely in response. To technology they couldn't replicate, to intelligence they couldn't even sense. Each technical solution arrived just late enough to be useless. The Metox detector appeared after early radar had vanished. The Naxos warning came once new wavelengths rendered it blind. The so-called snorkel, which let submarines breathe underwater, reached crews only when the war was already turning elsewhere. Their ingenuity had become reactionary, innovation trapped in bureaucracy. The Allies, by contrast, had learned to fuse their discoveries faster than Germany could categorize them. Ultra decrypted Dönitz's instructions. Operations research recalculated convoy routes automatically. Radar operators relayed to aircraft that could strike within minutes. Human and machine were merging into one decision cycle. Each Allied success redefined the next tactic almost instantly. Meanwhile, German command kept its divisions intact, intelligence separate from operations, research separate from strategy. Dönitz's structure rewarded hierarchy, the Allies rewarded velocity. What made the fall especially cruel was how logically it followed. Nothing Germany did in the Atlantic truly failed in isolation. Each decision made sense from inside the bubble of earlier wins. When B. Dienst cracked enemy codes, they assumed future superiority. When wolfpacks overwhelmed escorts, they assumed permanent dominance. When radar briefly seemed containable, they assumed counter-innovation would keep pace. The betrayal wasn't a sudden reversal. It was the accumulation of correct decisions made under false assumptions. Every success paved the road to the next disaster. By 1943, evidence of that trap was everywhere. Orders still demanded maximum offensive posture, even though every sortie drained crews and fuel for minimal reward. The fleet that once hunted in disciplined packs now resembled a scattering of fugitives. Yet Dönitz insisted the campaign merely required belief. He was fighting on reputation, his own included. The same moral certainty that had carried him through early triumphs now shielded him from adaptation. This blindness extended beyond him. German culture, steeped in the romance of engineered perfection, couldn't accept the messy logic of learning systems. They viewed Allied coordination as crude abundance rather than intellectual mastery. To them, victory should emerge from superior machines, not flexible networks. They misread improvisation as weakness. But in the Atlantic, improvisation had become science, the disciplined unpredictability that no static plan could anticipate. By the time German analysts admitted that Allied communications and detection formed a unified web, the web had already closed. Each intercepted signal accelerated the fall. The U-boat fleet, designed to operate invisibly, had become the most transparent force in the war. The betrayal was physical, almost poetic. Radio waves, once their greatest tool, now charted their graph. In hindsight, calling it betrayal isn't metaphor, it's mechanism. Victory betrayed them because victory validated the very flaws that would destroy them. The moment Dönitz saw his strategy proven, it stopped evolving. Each confirmation of dominance made adaptation feel unnecessary, each triumph another turn of the screw tightening behind him. When the system finally broke, it did so from structural integrity, the rigidity that had once made it strong. Among survivors, that realization hurt more than defeat. They had fought with absolute faith in precision and order, only to discover that war rewards those who change fastest, not those who believe deepest. Their technology was brilliant, their crews disciplined, but their thinking fossilized. While Allied scientists treated every engagement as data, German leadership treated every engagement as doctrine fulfilled. In the end, the U-boat empire was undone not by lack of courage or skill, but by the arrogance that early victory breeds. Dönitz had taught his officers that conviction itself could bend outcome, that willpower, multiplied by steel, could exceed probability. For a time, it did. But probability doesn't yield to faith. It pays in kind, patiently waiting for patterns to repeat. And when those patterns become predictable, even the most secret fleet turns into an open target. So the U-boat war died the same way it had lived, in strict formation, obeying orders shaped by ghosts of past success. The men still followed their charts, still trusted codes now compromised, still surfaced into skies they no longer controlled. What looked like resurgence in 1943 was really inertia, the body moving while the soul had already surrendered. What began as Germany's proudest military innovation ended as its quietest tragedy. Victory in the Atlantic hadn't been stolen by enemies. It had been forfeited through blindness. The betrayal wasn't committed by the Allies. It was written into the very confidence that once made the U-boats feared. Beneath that certainty, the seeds of ruin had always been waiting, ready to bloom the moment success convinced them they never need to change again. Lessons written beneath the waves. Long after the wrecks settled into silence, the Battle of the Atlantic continued to teach. What happened between 1939 and 1943 wasn't only a contest of ships and steel. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where information and adaptability mattered more than tonnage and firepower. The ocean became history's classroom, and the lesson etched across its surface was mercilessly clear. Those who stop learning sink. For the Allies, victory had arrived not through a single weapon, but through integration. Radar, sonar, encrypted radio, air power, and intelligence all fused into a single nervous system that could sense, think, and act faster than its enemy. Every convoy battle, every decrypted message, every radar contact fed the machine with more experience. It was evolution happening in real time. The war beneath the waves was no longer about who built the best submarine. It was about who learned the quickest. Dönitz's command never grasped that principle. The Germans built a fleet designed for mastery of fixed conditions, a design philosophy that viewed change as weakness. They believed that once perfection was engineered, it would stay perfect. But the Atlantic laughed at perfection. Storms, mathematics, and innovation favored the flexible. While German engineers polished their blueprints, Allied laboratories rewrote reality. From that imbalance emerged the first lesson of the deep. Dominance belongs to those who adapt, not those who perfect. You can trace that idea straight into modern navies. Today's anti-submarine warfare depends on the same logic born in 1943. Connect everything, act faster than the enemy can decide, and never rely on one source of truth. The systems may now use satellites, drones, and artificial intelligence, but the heartbeat is the same one that pulsed through Western approaches command. Sensors talk to analysts, analysts talk to operators, operators respond instantly. It's the living continuation of a network, first assembled to hunt U-boats through fog and fear. Second came the lesson of intelligence, specifically the danger of asymmetry. The Germans assumed breaking British codes meant superiority, but they underestimated what it meant to be outread. Ultra showed that secrecy and insight are two sides of the same coin. Whoever balances both controls the battlefield. Bletchley Park proved that knowledge could destroy more fleets than any battleship. It turned cryptography into strategy, and strategy into survival. Modern militaries still chase that model, the dream of perfect awareness, where every threat glows on a screen before it strikes. The irony is that even that dream carries the ghost of Dönitz's mistake, believing awareness can be permanent. The third lesson lies in cooperation. Before 1943, Allied branches operated like parallel armies, Navy guarding, Air Force patrolling, intelligence observing. The crisis forced them to merge. Mathematicians sat beside admirals, pilots coordinated with codebreakers. The ocean demanded unity faster than bureaucracy could supply it, so they built it themselves. Out of necessity came a template for multi-domain warfare decades before the phrase existed. Every modern task force, every joint command center that fuses data from air, sea, and cyberspace owes something to that improvised collaboration born over ice-cold swells. but lessons written in victory often hide their cost. Beneath the statistics, thousands of ships saved, tons of cargo delivered, lay more than 30,000 German submariners who never surfaced again. They died inside machines built from misplaced faith, swallowed by a strategy that couldn't see its own expiration date. Most were barely adults, entombed in pressure hulls that became symbols of national pride even as they turned into coffins. Their commanders preached duty, the ocean taught silence. In that silence, the fourth lesson endures. Progress means nothing without perspective. The human cost wasn't confined to one side. Allied sailors paid in nerves and sleepless nights. Convoy escorts lived weeks on end inside metal compartments, shaking from their own depth-charge blasts. They learned that survival depended on trusting calculations made by unseen experts, people they'd never meet, but who nonetheless guided every turn of their ships. That trust, blind but necessary, built the culture of cooperation that still defines military science today. Believe the data or die doubting it. There's a haunting symmetry between the myths of both sides. The Germans believed in individual excellence. The Allies learned faith in collective intelligence. One vision drowned, the other evolved, but neither was free from illusion. Behind every victory sat chance. A storm that hit a convoy, a radar malfunction that spared a submarine, a decoding delay that cost hundreds of lives. The Atlantic, more than any battlefield, exposed how fragile mastery is when measured against probability. That unpredictability is its last lesson. For scientists studying naval warfare decades later, those years mark the point when war shifted from art to algorithm. Decisions once made by intuition were replaced with data loops, prediction models, and statistical proof. Yet even as machines shouldered that burden, the essence remained human. Someone still had to decide when to trust a signal, when to act on it, and when to hold back. The Atlantic made every officer both engineer and philosopher, living proof that technology without judgment is just machinery adrift. Over 75 years later, submarines still prowl the same waters, armed with weapons undreamt of in Dönitz's time. They carry sensors linked by satellites, commanders who read data streams instead of periscope reflections. But the paradox persists. The more connected a force becomes, the more fragile it grows. Every system can be hacked, every signal traced. Modern fleets repeat the same dance between detection and evasion that defined 1943, only faster, quieter, and with exponentially higher stakes. Beneath each sonar, ping echoes the same warning from history. No network is unbreakable, no advantage eternal. Perhaps that's why the Battle of the Atlantic endures in every Naval Academy syllabus. It teaches humility disguised as strategy. It reminds sailors and scientists that innovation isn't a finish line but a current. You move with it, or it drags you under. Technology may have changed the surface of war, but the rhythm underneath remains ancient. Perceive, adapt, survive. For the men who went down inside the U-boats, no memorial could equal the weight of their final lesson. They believed they were the masters of the unseen, and for a time they were. But the sea has no patience for certainties. It absorbs them, dissolves them, carries the wreckage to the deep where light never reaches. Down there, amid twisted hulls and silent machinery, the history of the 20th century sleeps, proof that mastery turns meaningless the moment it stops evolving. Each sonar echo today is a conversation with that past. Each new submarine, each upgraded radar carries their ghostly signature. Because under every wave lies the same truth carved in pressure and salt. The future of warfare isn't written in victories, but in how those victories are understood. Beneath the waves, every triumph whispers its warning. Listen closely, and you can still hear it, the ocean murmuring its eternal command: learn or sink. The shape of defeat. By the time silence returned to the Atlantic, even the victors felt uneasy. What had started as a campaign for survival ended as a study in irony, an empire of submarines undone by its own success. Dönitz had reached for mastery and found extinction. The same formulas that once brought triumph now mapped his downfall. Victory had betrayed itself, turning certainty into quicksand. The U-boat war proved that power without adaptation isn't strength, it's a countdown disguised as confidence. Look closely at those final months, and the pattern emerges. Every technological edge the Germans built became a liability once they stopped evolving it. Their Enigma codes, once a shield, became a beacon. Their Wolfpack coordination, once brilliant, became predictable. Even courage, the one inexhaustible resource, lost value when the battlefield changed faster than belief. The lesson was blunt. Strategy that worships yesterday will always be sacrificed to tomorrow. What made the defeat so absolute wasn't that the Allies destroyed the U-boats. It was that the U-boats destroyed the idea of static perfection. Each crushed hull on the seabed marked another warning that success, once enshrined as doctrine, becomes its own enemy. Every system that refuses to change ends up serving those who do. That's why the Atlantic feels less like a victory parade and more like an autopsy of arrogance. The same principle defines modern warfare. Whether in cyberspace, deep oceans, or outer orbit, any force that treats innovation as a trophy instead of a habit repeats Dönitz's mistake. The ocean doesn't honor legacy, it honors adaptation. It rewards those who listen, recompute, and move with the current. Every encrypted transmission, every sonar pulse, still carries that echo from 1943, the whisper that no signal stays secret forever. In hindsight, the betrayal was almost poetic. The Germans sought control through technology, but forgot that progress always betrays its masters. By perfecting their system too soon, they doomed it to obsolescence. What looked like victory was simply the last moment before the rules changed. The Allies didn't just win a naval war, they redefined what winning meant. They built a model that would outlive the conflict, a living machine of intelligence, cooperation, and speed. Though history records it as an Allied triumph, the Battle of the Atlantic belongs to both sides for what it revealed. It showed that warfare evolved from courage to cognition, from steel to information. Every fleet, every pilot, every coder since has operated under its shadow. The shape of defeat in 1943 became the blueprint of modern command. Connect, predict, adapt, repeat. Down on the ocean floor, that truth still rests locked inside wreckage. The pressure hulls lie unbroken, filled with the silence of men who believed victory was a destination instead of a direction. Their story ends there, but its meaning doesn't. In the faint hum of modern sonar, their ghosts speak the same words their commanders never learned. Change is the only weapon that never runs dry. If you want to see how that revelation carried forward into the next generation of undersea warfare, watch what came after the surrender. A world preparing for a Cold War fought in whispers beneath the ice. Subscribe for more untold wartime stories that reveal how triumph and disaster rarely stand apart. They share the same surface, divided only by those who learn in time.